Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I'm your host, Paul Rader. Today, we're going to talk about one of the most critical parts of a campaign, and that's how to assess the strengths and weaknesses in a campaign. Back in my grad school days at the University of Florida, I was in their political campaigning program. And in my first semester, we had a class that was simply called Political Campaigning. And eventually we were given a Florida State House race that was going to happen the year after. So that was in 2018. My first semester was in 2017. And we had to create a campaign plan for either the Democrat or the Republican that was expected to be in the general election. And a core piece of that campaign plan, one of the earliest things that we learned in that class, is what is called a SWOT analysis, S-W-O-T. SWOT is an acronym for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. It's a 2x2 matrix with strengths in the top left, weaknesses in the top right, opportunities in the bottom left, and threats in the bottom right. And what you do is exhaustively list everything, and I do mean everything, about the candidate and the election, the actual race that they're running in, that can be either a boon or a bane to that candidate's campaign. And this analysis is a critical piece to figuring out campaign strategy, crafting the right messages for voters, effectively countering strategy from the opposition, basically anything that the campaign needs to do. A lot of it is informed by this SWOT analysis. And if you don't do the SWOT analysis properly, your campaign is going to fail at some point. So maybe you're thinking of working on a campaign. Maybe you're actually wanting to run for office yourself. And it doesn't matter if it's local, state, federal, really anything you're running for. And it doesn't even have to be for a candidate either. It could be for a ballot measure or for pushing for passage of a bill in Congress or a state legislature. The basic tenets of a SWOT analysis can also be applied to non-political contexts, such as marketing, where it's also used a lot. And aren't campaigns ultimately about marketing anyway? Or maybe you're just curious about the finer details of politics, and the details of how campaigns work is one of those things. Whatever the reason you want to know, I've got you covered. And so here is how campaigns assess, or at least should assess, the factors on their side and against them. And failure to do so properly can mean the difference between winning and losing the election. Now, why is it that many campaigns falter in evaluating their campaigns? It seems kind of obvious to list strengths and weaknesses in your campaign. But even though these things are so important to do, these campaign self-assessments, not every campaign is good at it. In fact, many of them aren't. And even if one campaign isn't good at it, the opposition might not be good at it either. So the one that does win may not even realize that their SWOT analysis stinks just because the other side was even worse at it. The thing is, candidates and their campaign teams a lot of times have trouble being completely honest with themselves. And it's for several reasons. Part of human nature is that we downplay or disregard the faults of ourselves and the people we agree with, and then we exaggerate or overly focus on the faults of the people we don't agree with. And a lack of self-awareness is rampant in politics, where a candidate or campaign can't see their issues or think they don't have any problems in their campaign. But it's not always a matter of self-awareness or dishonesty or anything like that. Sometimes it's just flat out embarrassment. I mean, do any of us want to admit something that we really don't like about ourselves? Do we want to admit that openly? Of course we don't. Or even if you're not admitting it to the public, you don't necessarily want to admit it to the people on your campaign team. That's natural too. So something like a scandal or an awful comment you made in the past, a gaffe, you put your foot in your mouth. All those kinds of things are painful to admit. Or if you aren't the candidate, maybe you are afraid to tell the candidate things that are wrong with them because you're afraid that they're not going to listen. They may demote you. They may fire you from the campaign. Maybe they're one of those quote unquote toxic positivity types where it's always got to be everything is is great and hunky-dory, and anybody who says otherwise needs to be pushed out. Unfortunately, that is a thing that happens even in political campaigns. But you have to be able to put yourself in the shoes of various people, especially voters, because these are the people who are going to decide whether they choose you or not. Even if you think something is not a problem, it may not be a problem personally for you, but it may be a problem for some other voters, including ones that you absolutely need to win. Or you might think a voter's grievance isn't legitimate or it's unfair. And you know what? Maybe it is. Maybe it is a ridiculous thing that they don't like about you. But you still have to account for it. Anything that could possibly hinder your campaign, especially if you're running for an election that's expected to be tight, that's supposed to be a toss-up, you have to be aware of any of these things that can and will be used against you. There's people that get paid a lot of money to do opposition research on you, or oppo for short. And so you really have to be as thorough as you can with these things. And also, these SWOT analyses are amendable throughout the campaign too. Sometimes even when people do have a good analysis of these strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats, they almost treat these things as static and unchanging, and they don't revisit these analyses. And that's not how they should be treated either. These are not static. Campaign plans in general are not static. Campaign seasons are long slogs, and lots of things are going to change during that time. And so you can revisit your plan and make changes when necessary. So, now on to the actual details of these SWOT analyses, and let's compare strengths and weaknesses. These are mostly focused on your candidate, or if you're on a campaign for a ballot measure or to try to get a legislative bill passed. These are things that are more controllable by the candidate. And what is it about your candidate specifically that can boost or hinder that candidate's campaign? And it doesn't necessarily have to be things that most voters can see. It might be things that you see more internally, like the ability to fundraise. That's not necessarily things that most voters are going to see. So these are things like character traits. What are the skills that candidate has? Their career background, their party affiliation, their physical attractiveness. Yes, none of us want to admit it, or a lot of us don't want to admit it, but physical attractiveness does sway some people's votes. It doesn't necessarily completely change their vote, but it also makes us more amenable to listening to somebody that we might not otherwise agree with. The candidate's demographic profile, their name recognition, the endorsements that they have, if they are an incumbent, any prior actions that they've taken or have been involved in, or previous comments they've made, their ability to fundraise. All of these things are, to some extent, things that candidates have control over more directly. And so, obviously, a strength of these is any of these things that can be treated as a positive aspect of the candidate. So, character traits that people like. Do people like that this candidate is seen as affable, or this somewhat nebulous concept of authenticity, which I did an episode on not too long ago? If people perceive that candidate to be authentic, or that they're considered strong and tough, and that they'll stand up to all these bad people. Or do they have good skills? Are they really good at public speaking? Or do they have really good body language? Or do they have expertise in certain issues that are going to be relevant to that campaign? And relatedly, do they have a relevant career background in that? So if healthcare is going to be the driving issue in that campaign, maybe that candidate is somebody who has a background in healthcare, like they're a doctor or a nurse or an executive in healthcare. Does the district have more of an affinity for that candidate's party? So if you're a Democrat in a Democratic district, or you're a Republican in a Republican district, that's a strength. If your candidate is good looking, we like somebody who's pretty. is the candidate demographically similar to the area that they are running for office in? So, for example, if it's a black candidate in a majority minority district, that can play very well. Are they well known? So they already have name recognition because of how long they've been involved in the community, for example. Are they endorsed by officials that are popular with that district? Now, that is to some extent an outside consideration, but what the candidate does can be a directly impact whether they get an endorsement from a certain official that is popular with that district. Good publicity in the past. You were well known for philanthropic endeavors or just working in the community in general. Are you good at fundraising? This is a critical skill. Nobody enjoys fundraising, no matter how much money they rake in. Not a single candidate that I can think of actually enjoys fundraising, but you got to be good at it. Because campaigns cost a lot of money, and some of them cost an exorbitant amount of money. And then obviously weaknesses are any of these things that could be seen as a negative aspect of the candidate. So character traits that people don't like. Somebody just is perceived to be slimy and sneaky. Maybe it's not fair or legitimate, but maybe that's how they're perceived, and you have to know that people feel that way. They have weak skills like they're not good at public speaking. They have an irrelevant career background, so maybe they're in a very agricultural district and they don't have a background in farming. Not necessarily that they can't win an election there, but they can't really use their career to say, hey, I'm a lot like the rest of you who are farmers. Actually, no, you're not, because you don't have a farming background. So that can be a weakness for a candidate. If the district is more hostile to that party, so if it's a very Republican district and you're a Democrat, or if it's a very Democratic district and you're a Republican. If your candidate is not attractive, and of course, attractiveness is to some extent in the eyes of the beholder, but there are some people that may be more generally considered to be unattractive. Maybe their candidate is demographically dissimilar to the area, so they don't really look much like the constituents, like the average constituent that they represent. They're little known, so they don't have a lot of name recognition. Or maybe they do have name recognition, but they're not viewed very well to begin with. So maybe like 80% of people know who this person is, but a majority of them don't like that person already. They're endorsed by unpopular officials. So if you're in a Democratic district and you're endorsed by the local Republican Party, probably not going to work out well. Just like if you're in a Republican district and you're endorsed by the local Democratic Party, probably not going to work out well. Bad publicity, like you committed some sort of dumb error in the past. You said something really horrible and mean that has just followed you for a long time. Or you were involved in a scandal. And then, of course, if you're bad at fundraising, you're probably not going to go anywhere because you're just not going to be able to generate enough money to keep yourself in the news or to get more ads on the air and to just generally fund all your campaign expenses. And so all of these strengths and weaknesses run the gamut of minor conveniences and inconveniences to major sticking points and everything in between. You can, if you do this analysis, you can sometimes put like, hey, this one is a big strength or a big weakness or a small strength or a small weakness. But you have to list all of these things out. And so sometimes a candidate aspect can also be considered a strength in one election year, but then is a weakness in a different election year. So you're a Republican running for the district 2 years ago, but there's been an influx of Democrats that have come in over those past 2 years. Now, maybe it's actually a weakness in your campaign that you are of that party. But it's not always obvious whether something is a strength or a weakness, so you might have to think things over. Not only that, some things can be both a strength and weakness. What? How does that make any sense? How can a strength also be a weakness? How can an asset of a political candidate also be a shortcoming? Well, for one, what plays well with one segment of voters won't necessarily play well with another segment of them, especially if you're in a very tight race. If we go back to the career background, maybe you're a farmer, or you have some sort of agricultural background, and so you have a large agricultural lobbying apparatus or there's a lot of agricultural lobbyists and lobbyist groups that are involved in that district, but there's also another group of people that are also powerful in that district. Maybe there's manufacturing, and sometimes maybe the manufacturing is at odds with the agricultural sector. So how do you toe that line there? Or you can fumble what should be a strength of your campaign. So if we talk about right now, this would be more applicable to Republicans, where you're running in a Republican district, but you're in a primary right now with several other Republicans, and you being a Republican should be a strength running in that Republican district, but maybe you're not seen as sufficiently supportive of Donald Trump. Or maybe you could maybe be a Democrat who's running and you're not seen as sufficiently in opposition enough to Donald Trump. So what should be a strength, you might not actually be able to harness very well. Or on the flip side, a weakness can be framed in a different way. Maybe you are an ex-convict and people generally don't like that, but you're able to parlay that into a redemption story where you say, I paid my debt to society and this is how I've actually given back to my community now. And maybe now you've actually turned that into strength. Because as much as we like to dog on people for all of their issues and things that they do wrong, we also love a good redemption story. So that could play well in a district. Whatever the case may be, you have to really make sure that your strength is a strength and your weakness is a weakness, and that you can't actually turn that weakness into a strength, and that especially that you don't turn that strength into a weakness, because that can very easily happen. Now, how about opportunities and threats? So these are mostly focused on outside factors that can propel your candidate or throw an obstacle in their way. So it's more external environment and climate, and also related to the other candidates in the election as well, especially if they're in the opposition party. If you're running as a Republican against Democrat, or a Democrat against a Republican, or if you're running as an independent against a Republican or a Democrat. And so these are less controllable things by the candidate, and they require much more reactiveness and proactiveness. Some things are going to come up in the election, in the race, and you're going to not be able to predict them, and you're going to have to be on your toes and be able to respond accordingly. Other things you'll have to be more proactive in, and you'll be able to be because you already listed all those potential threats and opportunities that you can, the opportunities that you can take advantage of and the threats that you try to minimize. And so examples like that are the national political climate. If your candidate isn't running for president, that's more relevant because you're not running for the entire nation. You're running for a statewide race or a district, so only a section of that state. Yeah, potential for debates. If there's planned debates there, whether they're already set up in the first place, or as a candidate, you're trying to call for debates to be held. And if there's some sort of spot in the campaign calendar where that can happen. Interviews and public speaking engagements, the opportunities for those, because whether there are fewer or more of them, those can be opportunities or threats depending on your candidate. What your opponent or opponents do well or poorly, whether it's a matter of their character or their skills, polling trends, salient political issues, the economy. All these things are things that your candidate, or you, if you are the candidate, have less control over. And so you have to react or be proactive in responding to those things. And so opportunities are whatever of those things that can be used to your campaign's advantage. So maybe the national political climate favors your party. Right now we're in a midterm year, and so the headwinds right now favor Democrats, and they do not favor Republicans. And so if you're a Republican running in a district that is more balanced or only slightly Democratic, or even if it's slightly Republican, that might hinder you because of your ties to Donald Trump. And midterms are always, or almost always, unfavorable to the party in power nationally. And in this case, it's Republicans, with them holding majorities in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate and holding the presidency with Donald Trump at the helm. Debates can also be opportunities for you if your candidate is good at public speaking or they're trying to get their name out there. So you say, well, debates are a really good avenue for doing so. Let me get my name out there and start arguing for my views. And so you got to be careful with debates because in general elections, they're not all that persuasive, or at least they tend to have short-term effects. But if you're in a primary, a debate can be a really good platform because people are still trying to figure out who to vote for their party. Favorable polling data. So if people know who you are, so name recognition is a common thing in polling. So if you have high name recognition, but people are neutral about you, they don't really know what they think about you, well, now that's an opportunity that says, hey, they don't dislike me, so here's my chance to make them like me. And they already know who I am, so I don't have to tell them who I am, but let me tell them why they should like me. A salient issue that your candidate has experience with. So maybe you are a doctor or a nurse, and right now healthcare is the big thing in your district because of whether it's nationally or statewide or in your district. Certain events related to healthcare have become more and more important. Well, now, as a doctor or nurse, you can, or anybody else involved in healthcare that is seen as a healthcare worker, probably not as a healthcare executive, probably not going to work as well. But if you are a doctor or a nurse or something similar to that, you can use that as an opportunity to bolster your campaign because you are somebody who has more direct experience with healthcare and serving patients. A good economy with your party in power or a bad economy with your party out of power. So you can use that to say, like, hey, look, the other party is terrible at their job. With us in power, the economy is doing well, so why don't we just keep this train rolling? You should vote for me because I am tied to the party that is in power right now. Now, yes, it's not necessarily saying that that party is actually responsible for the economy being good or bad, but we're talking about campaign strategies here. So this is how they're trying to paint things. This is the angle that these campaigns are taking. So if the economy is doing well, and you are of the party that's in power, you're going to try to seize on that. If your party's out of power and the economy is bad, you're going to seize on that too and say, look how terrible these guys are at running the country. You should vote for me because I am in the team that is not running the show. And then, of course, threats are anything that could be used to disadvantage your campaign. And whether that's from your opponents and their weaknesses or your campaign's errors. So the national climate is against your party. You're probably going to be facing some headwinds. We go back to debates. If your candidate isn't a good speaker, debates might not be a good idea because your candidate might fumble the opportunity. Doesn't mean that they should avoid the debate because then they might get knocked for, well, why are they avoiding debates? But you have to be really careful there. It's a fine line that you're walking. Not enough chances for interviews, so you're just not able to gain enough traction or you're not getting in front of a wide enough audience. Like you're getting only interviews with small scale media outlets, but not the really big ones. So if you're a Republican, but you're not getting on Fox News enough, or if you're a Democrat and you're not getting on certain liberal podcasts enough, that can be a threat to you. Something that your opponent does very well. So if you're a bad public speaker, but the other candidate is a good public speaker. Or unfavorable polling. So you are well known, but your perception is negative. People have a negative opinion about you. That can be unfavorable. A salient issue that your candidate is perceived to be bad at. So if you are a healthcare executive that's running and healthcare is a major issue, probably not going to be a good look for you because generally speaking, people do not have good opinions about healthcare executives. A bad economy with your party in power, or a good economy with your party out of power. So if your party's in power and the economy is bad, your party's going to be blamed, and you have to be careful about how much you tie yourself to the party at large. And then likewise, if the economy is doing well and your party's not in power, it's going to be harder for you to say, look how terrible things are here. Or at least you can't focus on the economic aspects. You have to focus more on some social issues, for example. And so there's all sorts of different avenues you can go with for opportunities and threats. But just like how a strength can be a weakness, or a weakness can become a strength, depending on the situation, an opportunity can also become a threat, and a threat can also become an opportunity. The timing of these things matters greatly. So there could be a significant national event that can heavily influence a campaign. We're talking about for example, the war in Iran, how that is having a negative impact on the Republican Party as a whole. So that can suddenly become a threat. And when elections, or when these campaigns were started, the Iran war was not even going on at that moment. You can also fumble an opportunity and then it becomes a threat. So you are using a debate to try to bolster your candidacy, but then you make a really, really dumb error. You just completely put your foot in your mouth. And now all of a sudden you have to do damage control. One example I can think of is back in 2016, there was the Libertarian candidate, Gary Johnson, actually used to be a Republican governor over in New Mexico, I believe. But he was running for president, and independents especially need any chance they can get at publicity, because they generally have much more trouble getting themselves in the news and on interviews. But they also have an even smaller margin for error than a Democrat or Republican does, because of all these perceptions about independents being, whether they're considered goofy or that they just don't have a chance. And so any gaffe that they make, any error that they commit, can tank any sort of potential that they have. And so for Gary Johnson, he was questioned on, at the time, what was going on in Syria, in the city of Aleppo. And Gary Johnson said, "What is Aleppo?" And I mean, it's not like he was going to win if he answered that question correctly, but any sort of chance that he did have was significantly tanked at that point. And also, especially for him as a libertarian, libertarians are often considered to be heads in the sand because they generally are opposed to any sort of foreign intervention. So, especially for independents, you have to really be careful of these threats. But it could still apply that to Democrats or Republicans, where there's something that they absolutely should know, and they screw it up, and all of a sudden now they've become a laughingstock. And in the same vein, though, you can also take what should be a threat to your candidate and turn it into an opportunity. So something that is a threat to your candidate, maybe that's actually also a threat to your opponent too. And so that could become an opportunity. Maybe you both are terrible at fundraising, but your opponent just happens to be worse at fundraising than you are. I mean, obviously it could still be a problem for you, but you can turn that into an opportunity because you have a better chance at raising more money. Or what was once a threat can suddenly become an opportunity. So if we say, just making this up as an example, I'm not saying that this is or isn't the case, but if we say Donald Trump is considered to be strong on foreign policy, but now with the Iran war, now all of a sudden people are turning on him and saying, well, now he's using too much force. Now that threat of, well, foreign policy was considered to be a strong point for Republicans, now it's suddenly becoming a threat to them. And if you're a Democrat, what was once a threat is now becoming an opportunity, because now your party might be looked to for what we should do on foreign policy. And so these analyses into what your candidate does well, what they don't do well, and what could help or hinder your campaign. It can take a while, but it's very, very important. And you can see that in a lot of actual examples of campaigns that we've seen. So with all these things in mind about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, now let's look at more practical applications of SWOT analyses in certain case studies. Campaign plans are rarely ever released to any extent in the public. I'm not going to say that they never are, because I don't think you can actually say that. But you rarely, if you are working on a campaign, you rarely ever want to release your plan, either in part and especially not in full. You don't want to invoke public ridicule, for example, potential ridicule, because somebody looks at something you said and they're like, what? They really thought that that was a good idea? Maybe something that they thought was a strength that people, if the SWOT analysis becomes more public, somebody might look at that and say, why would you think that's a strength? Why would you think that's a weakness? And then that becomes more fodder for media outlets to make stories about, whether they're clickbait or not. Some info might be proprietary and belong to whoever runs the campaign. So there might be an actual organization that helps out that campaign, but they don't want to give any sort of information to their competitors about how they create campaign plans and SWOT analyses, because then that competitor can eventually come and say to anybody so if company A is working for this candidate and how they create campaign plans gets out, company B can use that information to make their campaign plans better, but also to go to other candidates, prospective candidates that want to hire company A's service and say, company B can say, oh, no, actually, you know what? Here's what we actually do better than them. And so you don't want your competition to get a hold of that. And then you especially don't want your opposition politically to gain any more insight into your strategy. So if you're a Democratic organization and a Republican organization gets a hold of that information, they can see how you strategize and then are more effective at counteracting anything that Democratic organization does in the future. Or, of course, if a Democratic organization gets a hold of how a Republican organization does their campaign strategies. So all sorts of understandable reasons why campaign plans, in part or in full, would never be released. Again, there might be a few instances where that does happen. There probably is. I just don't know of them off the top of my head. And SWOT analyses are definitely a big thing that you would not want to get out, especially if you are honest and thorough in your campaign and you do list the weaknesses or threats to your campaign. Now the opposition has that and realizes if your candidate decides to run an election again, they can use those weaknesses and threats that you listed against you. So you want to keep those things as tight as possible to some extent, but we'll talk about that in a moment. There's also some reporting done on the internal workings of a campaign, especially in these post-mortems where the campaign has finally suspended operations, which really just means that they've ended operations, but they don't want to actually completely take themselves off of the ballot. And so you'll see journalists report on those kinds of things like, oh, the final days of such and such, or where this campaign went wrong. But the actual physical campaign plan will most likely not be available. So you probably won't be able to see the actual strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats listed, or any of the other strategic or tactical considerations for that campaign that are not necessarily directly related to that SWOT analysis. But while you don't have evidence necessarily to verify whether or not they did a sound SWOT analysis and self-assessment of the campaign, you can suspect whether their analysis was done well based on the candidate's actions and their responses to campaign-related events and basically anything that the campaign says or does, or that the candidate says or does. And there's many examples of politicians you can choose from, but I think a particularly good example to use in this case would be one that's very recent, Graham Platner in Maine. So Platner was, in case you don't know or in case you need a refresher, he was running for U.S. Senate against Susan Collins, and he just suspended his campaign, and now Maine has a new Democrat that is running in his place. But for Graham Platner, there are quite a few potential opportunities to seize on. The national climate is against Republicans this year in 2026, generally speaking. And his opponent, who's the incumbent, Susan Collins, she's sometimes at odds with Donald Trump, and publicly so. So she's possibly not going to be as strongly backed by Republicans this time, certainly not by Donald Trump, even if he gives a more tepid endorsement. But even if he gives a somewhat of an endorsement, there are going to be Republicans up there who say, well, you know what, Susan Collins has not been sufficiently supportive enough of Donald Trump, and they may just sit at home. But he also, Graham Platner, has had some potential strengths to lean on. He had more of a common person background, a regular person background as an oyster farmer, and he had a populist leaning that was working fairly well, and he was doing decently well in fundraising and gaining support in polling. But Graham Platner's candidacy was also marked by several controversies that he did not do well in preparing for or responding to. For one, he had a Nazi tattoo that he had covered up, and he said he did not know what it meant, though a couple of people that knew him said he did know the meaning of it when he got those tattoos, or that tattoo. He also had Reddit posts in the past that advocated for violence, that he said he went to war basically because he enjoyed killing people, something along those lines. He also downplayed sexual assault concerns, and he has since said he has disavowed those posts, but those posts happened. And there were also reports that that his wife told a campaign aide that Platner had been sexting multiple women, and he said that stopped before the campaigning and he got counseling for it. And then lastly, what ultimately did him in was that a former girlfriend accused him of raping and abusing her, and of course he denies that. So let's look at this through the eyes of a SWOT analysis. Any issues in the past, even if they were resolved or your candidate has changed as a person, those have to be internally discussed and listed on that SWOT analysis. Doesn't matter how embarrassing it is or whether you have moved on, you have to talk about them because it's going to come up. There's lots of people that get paid lots of money to do opposition research on you, and they're going to find out, especially when you run for something like U.S. Senate. It's going to come out. You may think you're going to be able to hide it, but it's going to come up at some point. Maybe not in this election, but it'll come up in another election that you run for, or while you're in office. And in campaigns, negatives are often more powerful than positives. It's human nature to latch onto the negatives, especially when it's a candidate we aren't predisposed to like. And it's why negative campaigning works so well, despite us saying, oh, we're so tired of all this negative campaigning. Can't we just have something more positive? Well, no, because we respond more to negative campaigning, even if we don't want to admit it. And so while it's all well and good to capitalize on your strengths and opportunities, and you should, you must be prepared for lines of attack because they will happen, and there is always something to attack you on, even if you don't think it's a problem. But candidate assessments like Graham Platner's bring up another critical question, and that's how do you get out in front of these potential threats to your campaign? So it's this divide between keeping things internal and externally sharing things. Again, you don't want to share your SWOT analysis with the public, but does it behoove your campaign to bring up any weaknesses or threats publicly before the opposition gets a hold of it? It's not always a clear answer, and some voters won't care whether you have changed or not, or whether you have resolved an issue. And even though voters say they want honest candidates, being too honest can hurt that candidacy. So let's say, he brought up the fact that he got that tattoo. And let's just say, whether we believe him or not, let's just take him at his word for this moment and say that he didn't know what that Nazi tattoo meant and he got it covered up and he was being honest about that. Well, would that have been better if he brought that up before it became an issue so that you can now turn that weakness into a strength and say, oh, well, you know what? He was actually very honest about that. He said that this thing he did in the past was not something he should have done. And here is him trying to make amends for that. him not bringing up anything like that before, now you can be seen as a hypocrite. Again, whether or not he was honest or not, that's beside the point here. It's completely antithetical to how he painted himself as a candidate while he was running. And you can say the same thing about these Reddit posts that advocated for violence or downplayed sexual assault concerns. That is antithetical to the platform that he was running on. Would it have been better for him to have gone out in front of it and said, by the way, I made these posts. I'm not this person anymore. He could have possibly turned that into a way to say, actually, this guy is very honest. He brought this up before anybody else did. But maybe people won't listen to that and they'll just hear that, oh, he got a Nazi tattoo. What a jerk. What a terrible person. Which, yeah, obviously should not be getting Nazi tattoos. And ignorance is not an excuse. But would that necessarily have been better for him to bring up beforehand? Maybe, maybe not. I can't say for certain that it would, but it might have actually worked out better for him if he brought it up before so that the opposition didn't get to attack him as harshly on it. Now, obviously, it would be ideal to not have any rapists and abusers in office because they have no business being there. They certainly have no business running for it. But at the same time, you're not going to expect somebody to say, oh, by the way, a former girlfriend says I sexually assaulted her. Yeah, nobody's going to say that. But you still have to be thorough and examine any potential lines of attack. Even if you don't see things the way that somebody else does, you have to be aware of those things. And you have to put yourself in the shoes of voters who are going to be choosing you and of the people you have personally interacted with in the past. Because if you're not, it's like you saw with Graham Platner, it's going to tank your candidacy. Whether your candidacy, regardless of whether you were a good candidate or not, or whether you had, quote unquote, the right policies or not. You're talking strictly from a strategy perspective here. So you have to be a lot better in putting yourself in the minds of other people, which a lot of people, not just in politics, but a lot of people in general are just not good at. So SWOT analyses are an incredibly vital part of your campaign plan because if you don't do it right, it's probably going to come back to bite you, as you saw with Graham Platner. So you have to think about what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, what your opportunities to help your campaign are, what are the threats to that are going to hinder your campaign or potentially hinder your campaign, and think about any ways that you can turn those weaknesses into strengths, ways you can turn those threats into opportunities, and ways to make sure that those strengths don't become weaknesses and that those opportunities don't become threats. And you can amend that SWOT analysis over time. But make sure if you are running for office or if you are working for somebody running for office, that you are as thorough as possible in all those respects. And that's going to do it for today's episode of the Politics with Paul podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening. And if you're on YouTube watching, please like, share, and subscribe this podcast. That's on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Any help you can provide is greatly appreciated in spreading the word and helping to improve civic education, political education. That is so important to me and to what I do. And links to the show notes, my works like my 5-day educational email course about how we can all more effectively mitigate toxicity and polarization in politics, my book on political independence and on Amazon. It's on several other retailers, but the link to the Amazon page is going to be in the show notes. My medium.com profile where I write on from time to time, and also my other links, my Facebook, LinkedIn, website, and email. So that's where I'll leave you today. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.